Okay, so the title of tonight's talk is called Getting to Know Your Genes. And I'm going to talk to you about a lot of things that you might have heard of before, maybe don't know so much about, but feel free to, jot down any questions that you have. Try not to make it too personal if you have anything personal, but at the end, as Audrey said, I'd be happy to answer any questions. So on tonight's agenda, first I'm going to introduce myself and the field of genetic counseling. Then we're going to talk about reproductive carrier screening, such as testing for Tay-Sachs disease, Gaucher, cystic fibrosis, and the like. Then I'm going to talk to you about cancer testing. I know Audrey had mentioned that you already had a talk with Sharsheret, who we work very closely with. They provide more support to people. We provide the genetic testing, so we work really nicely together. And then I'll give you some information about JCreen, which is where I work as a genetic counselor. Okay, so a little bit about me. So as Audrey mentioned, I went to Stern. Then I got my master's at Mount Sinai. I worked and live in New York. So I've been here my whole life, actually. I worked for many years at Montefiore Medical Center and started up a Jewish genetic testing program when I was there. And I've been at JCreen for the last 6 years. So what is genetic counseling? I think that there's a lot of misconceptions about what we do as genetic counselors. So I just wanted to introduce you to us, who we are. There are genetic counselors in many different fields of medicine, and I think we're going to be even more and more across the board, across all of medicine very soon, because we're constantly learning about the genetic basis of diseases. So I'll tell you a little bit about the more traditional places where you might see a genetic counselor, but fortunately, our field is booming, and hopefully we'll be training many, many more genetic counselors over the years, over the next coming years. But I want to let you know what I do, because maybe, this will speak to you, and maybe you'll say, hey, I should probably meet with a genetic counselor at some point. So genetic counselors have a master's degree in genetic counseling. Genetic counselors' jobs are to educate patients or people about why we think there might be something genetic going on with them, explain what type of testing is available to them, and then when the results are ready, we review them with the patient. So probably the most common places you'll see us would be in the reproductive field, like women's health, and also in cancer. And in women's health or reproductive genetics, you might see us when you're already pregnant. Sometimes there are abnormalities within the pregnancy, like, for example, let's say they do a blood test that shows an increased risk for Down syndrome. Or let's say you do an ultrasound and there are some markers on the ultrasound that might be indicative of some genetic disease. The doctor will have you meet with a genetic counselor. We'll walk you through the reasons why we might suspect there's something genetic going on. We'll offer you the appropriate test, and then we'll review the results when they come in. You'll also see us in the cancer realm. If somebody has a personal history or a strong family history of cancer, it might be due to something genetic. Might not be, but it might be. And a genetic counselor can talk you through that process as well, and talk to you about why you think it could be genetic, and talk to you about what the results mean when they come in. You might also see genetic counselors in the pediatric realm. So let's say you have a child who is not meeting the developmental milestones they should be meeting, or they have certain symptoms or certain facial features or other physical features that might have something to do with a genetic syndrome. You'll meet with a genetic counselor. You'll also see us in many different specialties. So there is neurogenetic counselors, there's cardiogenetic counselors. Like I said, we're kind of all over the place. So if anybody here has any concerns that there might be something genetic in their family, a genetic counselor is a great place to start your journey. So today we're going to focus on reproductive carrier screening. So you might remember the Punnett squares from high school biology. Maybe you erased it from your mind, but if you did, I will remind you. A recessive genetic disease is one that happens when you have two carrier parents who both pass along their mutations to their child. So here there's a picture of a carrier mother and a carrier father. Carriers of recessive diseases generally have no symptoms. So they have no idea that they're carriers, and they're just walking down the street, everything's fine. They have no idea that they're carriers because they don't have any symptoms. However, when you have a mom and a dad who both carry the same recessive disease, every time there's a pregnancy, there's a 1 in 4 chance, or a 25% chance, that the child will inherit both the mom and the dad's mutations, or in other words, that the child will have the condition. So again, there is a 1 in 4 chance for each child of a carrier couple to have the condition, and a 3 in 4 chance for them not to have the condition. Just so you know, every single pregnancy is totally independent of the other pregnancies that this couple has. So each one has a 1 in 4 risk independent of any other children they have or might have in the future. So most carrier couples, they have a low risk, and most people don't have affected children every time they have a baby, but it's luck of the draw, and it could potentially happen that a carrier couple could even have more than one child who's affected. Many of these conditions that we test for are much more common in people who have Jewish ancestry, specifically Ashkenazi or Eastern European Jewish. Tay-Sachs disease is, a really classic example of a Jewish genetic disease. Other common ones that you'll see in Ashkenazi Jews are cystic fibrosis. I'll list a couple more later, but there are other ethnicities that also have genetic diseases that they need to be concerned about. So it's not just us as Jews. This happens among other populations as well. For example, the African American population has an increased chance to be sickle cell carriers. Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews also have some diseases that they need to be concerned about. But many different ethnicities have conditions to worry about. Happens to be that we have the most, but that's just the way it is, and that's why we have carrier screening. So here's a quick history. I actually got this picture from my dad because he, many years ago, was part of the initial Tay-Sachs testing initiative in the Northeast. Back in the 1970s, it sounds like somebody's not on mute. I'm sorry. If you could just mute yourself.
Not entered any number.
Please just remember to mute yourself. Thank you.
Okay. So back in the 1970s, we didn't really know much about genetics. We knew a little. What we did know is that babies who have Tay-Sachs disease, were missing a certain enzyme. So we found out that their parents.
I can mute everybody, but then I will have to, Estie, you'll just have to unmute.
Okay. Okay, so back in the 70s, we identified that babies who have Tay-Sachs are missing a certain enzyme, and their parents had half of the normal amount. So there were a group of scientists who are all here in the white coats, and they would go around in this van around many different cities in the Northeast, in New York, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Boston. They go up around the Northeast area, and they would test people in shuls and JCCs and other community centers to see how much of this enzyme they had. If they found carriers, people with half the amount of enzyme, if they found carrier couples, I should say, they would advise that they don't get married because they knew that having a carrier couple would mean there's a high chance for their kids to have the condition. Nowadays, that's not what we advise people, but back in the day, in the beginning of genetic testing, that was the only advice that they can give people is don't even try because you're, risking it by having a child every time you have a child. We've come a really long way since then, since the 1970s. Over the course of years, we learned a lot more about the genetic basis of disease. And over the years, we've been testing for more and more and more diseases and adding more diseases to the panel. Right now at JCreen, we're testing for 225 conditions, and we're testing everybody, not just people who are Ashkenazi, also people who are Sephardi or Mizrahi, and even people who are of mixed ancestry, converts, really anybody. It's now what we call a one-size-fits-all test or a universal test, where we test everybody for everything. We cast a wider net so that we don't miss anybody. So in the 70s, when they were going around in the vans telling carrier couples not to get married, did it work? And the answer is yes, it 100% works. So here you can see the yellow line here is Jewish children who have Tay-Sachs, and the blue line is non-Jewish. You see that the number of cases of Tay-Sachs declined so much over those 10 years when they were going around in the vans, and the numbers just keep getting lower and lower. The reason is because they were educating the community and providing testing for people and giving them, an option when they found out that they were a carrier couple. So it's very, very rare nowadays for a fully Ashkenazi couple to have a baby with Tay-Sachs because there's just, like tonight, I'm educating you. There are many other educational events just like this, and there's a lot of knowledge within the community about the importance of testing. You'll see that the non-Jewish babies with Tay-Sachs, that number kind of stays around the same the whole time, which is just to show that these conditions are not exclusive to, or this condition, Tay-Sachs, is not exclusive to people who are Ashkenazi, more common in Ashkenazis, but it's not exclusive to Ashkenazis. Anybody could be a carrier for Tay-Sachs. However, the education and the outreach in the non-Jewish communities is not the same as it is in our community. So there just isn't enough or any really knowledge about the importance of getting tested. So unfortunately, there still are babies being born with Tay-Sachs disease, but most of the time those babies don't have Jewish parents because their parents had no idea that this was a thing, that they needed to do, like we know in our community. Here are a couple of the diseases that we're testing for. I didn't put all 225 down. These are the more common ones. You might have heard of some of them. On the right side, it just lists how common it is in people who are Ashkenazi. So Gaucher disease, a very common one, Tay-Sachs, cystic fibrosis, 1 in 25 Ashkenazis will be a carrier, etc. So this is kind of like the original panel of diseases that we were testing for. But as I mentioned earlier, we've come a very long way, and now we're testing for many more than just this. So why test? So in Devarim, it says, Rak hishamer lecha u'shmor nafshecha me'od v'nishmartem me'od lenafshotecha, which means that you should safeguard your own health. In the medical field, I find that a lot of people quote this pasuk when they're talking about the mitzvah of v'nishmartem me'od lenafshotecha. So, people like to apply it to what they're doing so that they can make it clear to people how important it is that you're fulfilling a mitzvah by doing whatever, preventative tests you can possibly do by safeguarding your health. So you'll hear it, in the cancer screening realm, people should get mammograms, people should get colonoscopies to safeguard their health. You'll hear it in the vaccine realm, take vaccines so your children don't get sick. In my realm, I'd like to also kind of connect it to that. I mean, I believe that testing yourself before having children is a way of fulfilling this mitzvah of v'nishmartem lenafshotecha, right? You are safeguarding your own health and the health of your family, your future family, by getting tested appropriately. In the 70s and 80s, when they were going around in the vans doing the testing, somebody asked Rav Moshe Feinstein what his opinion was. And here it's written out, I don't have to read the whole thing in Hebrew, but he basically said that not getting tested is like crossing the street with your eyes closed. Who would do that? So he basically said it's a no-brainer. Of course you should get the test done. I'd like to think that nowadays when we're testing for more than just Tay-Sachs, he would agree that we should be testing for everything. But he made it abundantly clear that doing this testing when planning for a family is definitely something that we should be doing. Some facts or some statistics about Jewish genetic diseases. Most babies or most families that are affected by these kind of genetic diseases have no family history. So most of the time, it's a surprise to families. The reason is because even though the carrier status is being passed down from generation to generation to generation, it's not that common to see a carrier couple, right? It's not that common to see two people who happen to carry the same thing and then also have a child with a condition. So it takes a lot of things to get to that point, having an affected child. So most of the time when somebody actually does have an affected child, they're the only ones in the family to have it. And that's why most people are surprised when their child is born with one of these conditions. Most people who do come through JCreen and get tested on our pretty large panel are going to end up being positive for 1, 2, 3, 4 diseases. We're testing for so many conditions, and they're all so common that I pretty much expect that everybody's going to be positive for something. Most people are not fully negative. So it's totally normal to be a carrier. It's not, anything that should be stigmatized. As I mentioned before, being a carrier really doesn't mean anything about your own health. They're generally healthy people. It's just something that you want to be careful about so that there are no surprises in the future. So who should get carrier screening? Anybody planning to have a family in the future. It doesn't make a difference if they're Ashkenazi, if they're Sephardi, if they're mixed, if they have no Jewish genes at all. Anybody planning to have a child should get tested. By JCreen, and in most places, you must be at least 18 years old to get tested. Where to get tested? JCreen, I told you a little bit later, I'll talk to you more about us, but we are an at-home online testing program, or we go to community events also. Some people might want to meet with a genetic counselor in their office. I would definitely recommend that people do that if there's something else in their family that they want to discuss, something extra beyond just, I want to have a child, I want to do my carrier screening. So let's say they have a family history of Down syndrome, or they have a family history of hemophilia or a heart defect, or whatever it is. If there's something beyond just the standard needs to get testing before I have a baby, I would recommend that you see a genetic counselor. Your doctor can also do the test for you. I would recommend that if you do ask your doctor to do it, like your OBGYN or your internist, it's always a good idea just to ask them a little bit more, like push them a little bit and say, what test do you do? How many diseases are you testing for? because doctors are very busy and they're experts in their field, but they're not necessarily experts in genetics. So they might not be as up to date on the genetic testing panels that are out there. So I would just, encourage you to ask and make sure that you're doing a good test and not, a test that was popular 10 years ago. Another option that we give people is Dori Sharim. Some of you might have heard of this program before, some of you might not have. I don't want to go into too much detail about them, but they are another Jewish program, just like JCreen, where they provide testing, but they do not provide the results. People instead are matched by a third party, by Dori Sharim, where they'll tell them whether or not they're a carrier couple. So they don't know what they carry or don't carry, but all they know is that they are a carrier couple or they're not a carrier couple. I put not 23andMe in big letters. You might have heard of 23andMe before. Maybe you've seen their kits, in commercials. I actually just saw a couple weeks ago, there was a kiosk in Target that had a bunch of 23andMe boxes. They're pretty big out there. So I just wanted to let you know that 23andMe has a few different types of tests that come with your report. So they have ancestry, they have genetic traits like, do you flush when you drink alcohol? Do you like the taste of cilantro, or does it taste soapy to you? Are you right-handed or left-handed? Like traits that have nothing to do with anything medical. Those traits and also the ancestry, I like to call recreational genetics, which is fun things to know about yourself, but it's not health related, and that's fine. 23andMe is good for that stuff. However, on their reports, they also have some results related to medical things like cancer genetics. Are you a carrier for Tay-Sachs and 20 or so other conditions? And I will say, do not trust those results if you ever do 23andMe. It is not a medical grade test. They're using a pretty old school technology that's really not so good. And their testing is also very limited. So don't say, I did 23andMe, I never have to do any more carrier screening, please. You could do it for the ancestry, you could do it for the recreational stuff. But please don't rely on it for the medical things. It's always important to use a medical grade test when you're doing this kind of stuff, this heavy kind of stuff. When to get tested before a pregnancy. It's always better to do it before a pregnancy than during a pregnancy. You'll see why in a minute. Before a pregnancy is a very vague term. I know that. For some people, it means before you even go out on a first date. For other people, it might mean when things are starting to maybe get serious. For other people, it might mean the day before you get engaged. They get a lot of frantic phone calls from moms like, my son had the ring and he needs to know the results today, so please don't do that to us because we don't have that much time. But, some people wait till they get married and deal with it then. But whatever it is, make sure that it's before a pregnancy because you'll have more options available to you in case there is a problem if you're not already pregnant. Another thing is that this is before any pregnancy, not just a first pregnancy. So if somebody had a baby and is planning for another baby, even if the first one is healthy, it's still a good idea to make sure that you have the most up-to-date testing because you're a carrier for something, whether you know it or not. So if there's a better test out there, better than the first time you got tested, it's always good to update your testing. So anybody should get tested before any pregnancy. So what happens when we have carrier couples? As I mentioned earlier, most people that we test are going to be positive for something. Not that common for us to have carrier couples where they're carriers for the same thing, but it happens, and when it happens, we always speak to our patients, or, you'll speak with a certified genetic counselor, and we'll talk you through the different options. We'll talk to you about the condition, what it actually looks like on a day-to-day basis. Is there a treatment? Is there no treatment? We'll kind of give you the nitty-gritty about what the condition is, and then we'll talk to you about what your options are. So I put these in no particular order. I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but I'll kind of run through them. And, we understand that every couple is coming from a totally different place, and we can empathize with that. And we, want to give you and educate you about everything and, help you decide what makes the most sense for you. So the first option that I have here is disqualification before dating. That's kind of the Dori Sharim model where people won't even go out on a first date. Excuse me. If they learn that they're a carrier couple. Some people who are already dating will decide to break up. Some couples might decide not to have children at all. Some might decide not to have biological children, they might adopt. Some couples might decide to use a donor sperm or egg from somebody who is tested and is not a carrier. I'm sure Rabbi Grossman can speak to this. There are a lot of halachic issues related to this, but in some cases it would be allowed. Some couples will take a chance. They'll say, there's a 25% chance, which means that there's a 75% chance that it's not going to be a problem. And they'll just, get pregnant naturally and hope it's going to be okay. These couples do have the option to test a baby during a pregnancy. So I'm just going to go to the next slide to show you what I mean here. There are two different tests that you can do during a pregnancy to see whether or not it's affected, the baby's affected with the condition of concern. The first test is called a CVS, which is short for chorionic villus sampling. The second one is called an amniocentesis. Both tests tell you the same information. They're just different in the way that they're done and the timing of when you can do it. So a CVS you can do earlier on in a pregnancy towards the end of the first trimester. An amniocentesis you can only do after that, like at around 16, 17 weeks in the pregnancy and beyond that. So if you know that there might be a problem, it's always better to get the results earlier and to do a CVS. A CVS is a test where the doctor does an ultrasound, they see exactly where everything is, and when they get a good picture, they take a needle, they put it through the mother's belly. With a CVS, they take out a little bit of the placenta. With an amniocentesis, they take out some of that amniotic fluid that the baby's floating around. The placenta and the amniotic fluid both have baby cells. So whatever you see in either of those two samples should reflect what's going on in the baby. So it's a way of getting baby cells without actually touching the baby. The ultrasound is on the whole time with both procedures, so they know exactly where they're going. There is a slight risk associated with either procedure, and it's a slight risk of miscarriage, but the results would tell you the baby has it or the baby doesn't have it. So it's a diagnostic test, which would tell you yes or no. If the baby doesn't have it, great, you never have to worry about it again for this baby. If the baby is affected, the couple is going to have to think about what to do with the information. You know, there's a lot of factors that go into this. Some couples will say, okay, now we know, we're going to do as much research as we can. We're going to educate ourselves. We're going to find the right doctors to treat the baby. We're going to be ready for this and have the rest of the pregnancy to prepare for it. Other couples might decide not to continue the pregnancy, and I'm sure Rabbi Grossman could speak about that as well. I will say I've been working in the frum community and the not frum community for many, many years, and I've seen all of these things, you know, being done. There are so many exceptions to every rule, and I always tell people, like, ask your rabbi. Don't just assume anything because every case is so different. And there are so many reasons why it would be good to terminate or be allowed to terminate, I should say. And there are many reasons it wouldn't be. So every case is so different than the next. And I always encourage people to speak to their rabbi when they're in these situations. Just going back to this last slide, the last option that we give people is to use assisted reproductive technology, such as IVF, with genetic testing of the baby. So going back to this picture here, IVF, you might have heard of more in the realm of, you know, infertility, couples having trouble getting pregnant. What does an IVF cycle look like? The woman gives an egg sample, the man gives a sperm sample, they put it together in the lab, and an embryo is created in the lab. They let that embryo grow for a few days, and then they take the embryo and they implant it into the woman's uterus, and hopefully it takes, right? Hopefully she gets pregnant with that baby, and hopefully there's a successful full-term pregnancy. What I'm suggesting here is that a couple who's at high risk to have a child with a genetic disease, they can undergo the same exact IVF where they create the embryo outside the body, but they add in one step towards the very end called PGT, or pre-implantation genetic testing, where they take out a few of the cells of that embryo and they can do genetic testing on those cells. If they see that the embryo is not affected with the condition, again, 3 in 4 chance, great. I'll take that embryo, they'll implant it into the mother, and hopefully it will take. Hopefully it will be a successful pregnancy. It's a child that will not have the condition because the embryo is normal. If they see that the embryo is affected, 1 in 4, they'll take that embryo and they'll discard it. It will never become a baby. It will never enter a woman's body. It will never become anything more than that. Just like I mentioned before, there are many circumstances where IVF is allowed. Even more so, usually it's you know, at the top of the list. You know, it's the most preferred in many cases, but again, always good to ask your rabbi what they think. When we have carrier couples, like I said, you should consider speaking with a rabbi. Another thing I find really helpful is to speak with other couples who've been through the same thing. You're not always going to find somebody with the exact same condition and the exact same backstory, but I think it's helpful to speak to people who've had bad news and how they dealt with it and what their experiences was, because hearing anything firsthand is always better and will help couples make a decision. And that's pretty much it. So I'm going to move on to our cancer testing part, and then I'm going to speak a little bit about JCreen. So last January, JCreen launched a second test. So not our reproductive carrier screening, we launched a new test called our Cancer Gen test. Our cancer gen test is totally different than what we were discussing before. What we do is we look at 63 different cancer predisposition genes, such as BRCA. These genes are associated with over 40 types of cancer, and testing must be done on at least a 21-year-old. So what will cancer genetic testing tell you? So if somebody has a mutation in any of these 63 cancer genes, that means that they have an increased risk for cancer. Depending on what gene it is, it's going to be a different conversation because different cancers are associated with different genes. Also, the amount of risk or the degree of risk will also differ depending on what gene it is. So here I put an example of BRCA1 or BRCA1. I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have heard of this gene. When somebody has a mutation in the BRCA1 gene, they have an increased risk for certain cancers. So females who have a BRCA1 mutation have an increased risk for breast cancer. So this is the general population risk, the basic risk for all women, but BRCA1 carriers have a much higher chance, almost 90%. Ovarian cancer as well, not a very common cancer in the general population, but a pretty increased risk for people who are BRCA carriers. And women also have an increased risk for pancreatic cancer. Males who have a BRCA mutation have an increased risk for male breast cancer. Males can get breast cancer. They also have a slightly increased risk for prostate cancer and the same risk as women for pancreatic cancer. So again, if somebody has a mutation or a break in their BRCA1 gene, they have an increased risk for these cancers. Notice that none of them are 100%, so it's not a guarantee that somebody who has a mutation will get these cancers, but the risks are, quite significant, especially for women. The reason why I thought that many of you might have heard of the BRCA gene before is because being a carrier for a mutation in the BRCA1 or 2 gene is very, very common in Ashkenazi Jews. So just like Tay-Sachs is common in Ashkenazi Jews, so is BRCA mutations. The general population chance to be a carrier for a BRCA mutation is about 1 in 500. If somebody's Ashkenazi Jewish, it's about 1 in 40. So it's almost the same risk as being a Tay-Sachs carrier, actually. So just being Jewish alone makes somebody at a higher than average risk to carry a mutation in the BRCA1 or 2 gene. The way that these mutations are passed down is called dominant. If somebody has a mutation in the BRCA gene or any of the other genes that we're testing for, there's a 50% chance they're going to pass it down to each of their kids, regardless of their gender. It doesn't make a difference if they're male or female. There's a 50% chance that each of their kids will get that same mutation. If the child does not get the mutation, it stops there. Like their children, wouldn't be at risk unless their spouse also happens to have it, but that's pretty rare. And if the person is positive, just like the parent, then that person would also have those risks and they would also have a 50% chance to pass it down to their kids. When somebody tests positive, they meet with a genetic counselor and we talk to them about what they can do with this information, right? We don't want to just say, hey, you have a high chance of getting cancer. Good luck with that. We want to empower people with this information. And depending on what gene it is, there are going to be different recommendations or guidelines that we tell people, but here's a general overview. Sometimes they can do increased cancer screening. So let's just say for breast cancer or colon cancer, let's say, people might do imaging like a mammogram or a colonoscopy starting at a younger age than is normal, and also maybe doing them a little bit more often than typically somebody might do. So, the whole point is if it's going to happen, let's catch it at an early and treatable stage by checking very often and using different types of imaging studies to see what's going on. Another option that you might be given if you're positive is to undergo preventative surgeries or risk-reducing surgeries. So for example, if I'm speaking to a woman who is a BRCA carrier, we'll talk to her about doing a surgery to remove her ovaries and her fallopian tubes because that would greatly reduce the chances of her getting ovarian cancer. You might have also heard of the idea of getting a mastectomy, pre-diagnosis for the same reasons. In some cases, if somebody already has a cancer diagnosis, there might be certain circumstances where we would choose a therapy or a chemo or radiation or some kind of treatment depending on what mutation they have, if any. So it could be really helpful in some cases in terms of figuring out what the best medication or the best treatment protocol would be. And in addition to this, you might remember this from before, IVF and PGT, when they test an embryo to see whether or not it's affected. You could do the same thing with the cancer genes. If somebody has a cancer mutation and they know they have that 50% chance of passing it on to their kids, and they want to make sure that doesn't happen, they want to ensure that they're not passing it down, they can undergo IVF and they can only implant embryos that have not inherited the mutation. Not as common to do this as it is for Tay-Sachs and some of those other conditions, because this for BRCA and these other cancer genes, those are, for adult onset conditions, not conditions that could affect babies. So even though it's available to people, it's not as commonly done. Maybe in the future things will change, but right now it's not so common for people to undergo IVF just for a cancer predisposition. And it's really important to share the information with your family members, right? Because it's not just your kids, it's your brothers and sisters and parents and aunts and uncles and cousins who might also be positive. So knowing that you're positive, you can help yourself, you can help your kids, and you can also help your other family members. A little bit about JCreen. The JCreen process for both of our ReproGen tests, that was the original one with the Tay-Sachs, and the cancer gen test that I just discussed, it's the exact same process, but 2 totally different tests. You go to our website, jcreen.org, and you request a kit. Most people request them to their homes, but every now and then we do screening events at shuls and schools, campuses, Kollels, Chabad, you name it. We go to different communities, and maybe we'll even come to your community if you invite us. We'd be happy to. But yeah, most of the time people just do it from home, but sometimes we'll do it at events. They request a kit, they give us some information about themselves, about their doctor. In most states, it is required that a doctor signs off on all genetic testing. So your doctor will be part of the process. We'll have to make sure that the doctor signs the order for you. Once all of that is squared away, we'll send you a spit kit in the mail. You just spit into this tube, send it back to the lab. The results usually take about 3 weeks. And when the results are ready, we will let you know that they're in, and we'll have you set up an appointment with one of our genetic counselors, either by phone or by Zoom, to review the results. And then afterwards, we'll also send them to your doctor. So your doctor is kind of there the whole time. A genetic counselor is there throughout the way as well, throughout the whole process as well. We are based out of Emory University in Atlanta. So we're based out of their Department of Human Genetics. This is a medical grade test. This is legit, this is the way to get testing done, having a genetic counselor there throughout the process. Every single aspect of the test is done using HIPAA compliant and secure methods. So everything is, safe and confidential. This is a picture of our website. When you go to it, you can choose between the ReproGen or the cancer gen test. Some people decide to do both. Here's the pricing for our test. I actually just today got word from our outreach coordinator that we just got a grant that is actually really helpful to you guys. If you use this coupon code, you can screenshot this or write it down. I'll leave it here for a minute. You can get a free ReproGen test or a $50 cancer gen test. So that's quite a discount. And this offer expires on the 15th of October. So I'll leave this here for a second if anybody wants to write it down. If you don't get it, I'm sure Audrey will have it. I'll email it to her as well, or you're welcome to email me. But please, you can use this. You can share it with anybody who's in your area. So that's the DC area, Silver Spring, Potomac. I don't know every single city close to you guys, but anywhere near where you are in the Metro DC area is welcome to use this until the 15th of October. One more reminder that I just want to end off with is you don't have to be Jewish to have a genetic disease. I know that we've been focusing on Jewish people have diseases, but there are other ways and other reasons that genetic diseases happen. It doesn't all have to do with your ethnicity. So here's a really good example: Down syndrome. You might know somebody who has Down syndrome. Down syndrome occurs when a person gets an extra chromosome of 21. Normally we have 2 of every chromosome. They come in our pairs, but for 21 we get 3. That's because one of the parents mistakenly gives an extra chromosome. Very often it's from the mother. As moms get older, it's more likely for this to happen. It doesn't always happen because of this, it's just more likely. When this happens, it's just a spontaneous thing that happens. It's not something that was running in the family most of the time. It has nothing to do with your genetic background or your family history. It's just a spontaneous thing that happens. So again, not all genetic things have to do with being Jewish. Sometimes it just happens. Why is it doing that? I'm sorry. Here's my contact information. You could screenshot this as well, and Audrey will have my information as well. And here is our social media. Please follow us. We have some pretty good content, some fun stuff, a lot of educational content. And I am done.
Wow. That was a lot of information packed in. Thank you so much, Estie. I have heard a lot of talks about genes, and I feel like I learned a lot. So I'm so appreciative. I'm going to remind everybody, I'm sure you have questions. Feel free to put them in the chat. Your questions will only be visible to me and to Dr. Shadovsky, and one of us could present them on your behalf at the end after Rabbi Grossman speaks. So if you feel like asking a question anonymously, that's fine. We will not mention your name in the question. If for some reason you want your name mentioned, you can let us know in the chat. So once again, thank you to Estie from JCreen. And I would like to now introduce Rabbi Grossman from the Washington Community Kollel to speak to some of the halachic aspects of the topics that Estie touched upon. Rabbi Grossman.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That was fascinating. That was really interesting. So Estie covered the science, the technical aspect of this, the social aspect of this. I'm going to cover some of the halachic, moral aspects of this from a Torah perspective. So regarding the testing itself, there are roughly 4 questions I'm going to address. What is the Torah's attitude toward genetic testing in general? If we test, what diseases should we test for? What are the criteria for deciding what to test for? All 225, a smaller set, a larger set. When should people be tested? At what point, from the Torah's perspective, do we recommend testing? And what should be done with information? Should it be revealed to the people? Should it be kept discreetly? Afterward, if we have time, I'll touch on some of the questions Estie raised about. I'll touch briefly on the questions of donor sperm and egg as a possible solution to certain problems, and to other types of things interventions we might do if we discover that unfortunately a child is carrying one of these diseases. So the question of the Torah's attitude toward testing in general. So this is a question, as Estie mentioned, that the scientists began to understand this, began to get a handle on this in the 70s. In the 80s is when the rabbinic literature on this topic was largely composed. The Dar Yesharim organization she mentioned was founded in the 80s, and many of the leading rabbis in the United States, some in Israel, discussed this issue around that time, around 4 decades ago in the 80s. Now, in general, there's a pretty strong consensus among authorities in Torah law and ethics that this is permitted and even recommended and even required, according to many authorities. In general, the Torah's attitude here is pretty pragmatic. We can save lives of children. We can save unspeakable misery of children, of their parents. We can save marriages from being destroyed. There are apparently very high numbers of marriages that get damaged due to devastating things like these diseases. So on the whole, there's a simple pragmatic argument that this is a no-brainer to do this, because why shouldn't we? And in general, the consensus of Torah thought lines up pretty well with that intuitive position that if we can, then we should do it. This was not universal. There were holdouts, but as close to a consensus, almost as close to a consensus as you're likely to find, was that testing in general is a good idea. Estie mentioned Moshe Feinstein's position. Rabbi Feinstein was the leading authority in the United States in his era. He discussed this shortly before he died in the 80s, but he wrote unequivocally. He wrote a couple of letters strongly recommending that people be tested. He has that quote that Estie mentioned, that deliberately choosing to not test when you can is like closing your eyes, declaring present danger. Herschel Schechter has made similar points. Yeshiva University has made similar points that you should test for everything, he said. He said, why not? Anything you can test for. Not testing when you can, why shouldn't you, he said. It's if danger can be averted, why wouldn't you avert danger? What's the issue? Why does not everyone agree to this? So there are several issues that are raised by various authorities. The primary one concerns an interesting verse in the Bible in Dvarim. It says, Tamim tiyeh Hashem Elokecha. There's an exhortation, an imperative from God that we should be tamim, complete or whole or trusting or simple. With God, we should trust God. The context is the previous verses deal with different types of occult procedures, divination, magic, sorcery, necromancy, all types of ways that people, the ancients in particular, used to try to get more information than could easily be available to them. The Torah warns us not to do this. The Torah commands us, Tamim tiyeh Hashem Elokecha, we should be whole and trusting and complete with God. And then it says the one outlet we have for inaccessible information is prophecy. God will send us prophets and they'll tell us things we need to know. So Ramban, Nachmanides actually counts this as a mitzvah. One of the 613 commandments is Tamim tiyeh, not to turn to occult and not to try too hard to access otherwise inaccessible sources of information. The question is, what exactly does this mean? Is a weather forecast a violation of Tamim Tia? If I listen to a meteorologist who tells me there's a 75% chance of rain tomorrow, if I ask a financial forecaster, a modeler who can predict the stock market or the economy or interest rates, if I ask him to build me a model so I can decide how to invest, am I violating Tamim Tia Hashem Elokecha? What am I not allowed to do? That God gave us brains, God gave us science, God gave us the ability to think, to analyze, to reason, and to model and to forecast. So what exactly is prohibited by Tamim Tia Hashem Elokecha? It's not clear. This is not a commandment that has been discussed at length, rigorously, in a technical and formal way by traditional authorities. By and large, the assumption seems to be either that it is limited to the occult, that the prohibition is on using occult means, paranormal means of divining the future, of accessing hidden knowledge, doesn't refer to science, doesn't refer to using the laws of nature, to operating, in which case, of course, it's not relevant for us. There are some authorities here and there who do seem to say either explicitly or implicitly that it can even refer to non-paranormal, can even refer to scientific methods, that there is such a thing as some knowledge that is off limits, but it's not well defined. And again, as we said, however they understand the scope of this prohibition of Tamim Tia Hashem Elokecha being complete and trusting with God, the general consensus, as we mentioned earlier, is that it does not limit using science, using technology for the improvement of the human condition. Rabbi Feinstein himself, in his seminal response on the question, Rabbi Feinstein himself raises the issue of Tamim Tia Hashem Elokecha, that we should be complete and trusting with God. He says it does not apply. It does not apply to genetic testing. He was discussing testing for Tay-Sachs, the original testing. He said it does not apply. And the reason he gave is that since it is so easy, it is such a simple matter to test, he said, it's even easier today, I'm sure, than it was then. But he says, since it is such a trivial thing, such a simple thing to test, he says, again, he uses that language that we heard earlier, that not testing when it's literally, almost literally in front of your eyes, he says, that's not Tamim Tia, that's just willful blindness, and that is not appropriate. And in general, the Torah authorities who discuss this question, they give several criteria to determine whether something would violate Tamim Tia Hashem Elokecha. One is Rabbi Feinstein's. How easy is it to check? If it involves something complicated, something difficult, something expensive, maybe there would be a violation of Tamim Tia. It's a continuum. To the extent that something is easy and trivial, then it would not violate Tamim Tia Hashem Elokecha. The other criteria they use in general to decide whether testing is something the Torah would encourage, and this takes us to the question of what diseases to test for, is the question of other questions, including how serious is the disease. Testing for a devastating condition like Tay-Sachs, which is fatal within a few years. The child will die within a few years and have a terrible, terrible life during his life, as opposed to something which is a manageable condition, maybe a chronic condition, but something that you can live a full and rich life. So the Tamim Tia is going to be less of a concern when we're dealing with something as devastating and as fatal as Tay-Sachs. And then the other question they deal with is probability. Testing for something which is, we saw the numbers for Tay-Sachs, 1 in 25 people being carriers. Testing for something which is so common and so frequent there's going to be a much stronger case for testing for something like that than there is for testing for something which is much rarer, which is much less frequent. But in general, so these are the criteria that halachic authorities have used to determine whether something would violate Tamim Tia or not. Again, implicitly, someone could simply argue that Tamim Tia is limited to the occult and has no relevance to science. But even among those authorities who do seem to say that Tamim Tia may apply even to certain types of scientific and technological processes, but in general, to the extent that something is deadly, is common, and to the extent that the testing is relatively easy, then the overwhelming consensus of Orthodox religious authority has been that testing is permitted, is recommended, and even required. Even stronger language than Rabbi Feinstein is used by Rabbi Moshe Stern, the Debreciner Rav. Rabbi Moshe Stern was an interesting figure. He was another leading American halachist in New York. Unlike Rabbi Feinstein, who was more American, who was more of Rabbi Stern was a Hasidic, came from the Hasidic circles. He was very, very conservative, very, very reactionary in some ways. But yet, when it comes to many issues involving science, He was vehemently opposed to smoking in some of his response. So when it comes to certain scientific issues, Rabbi Stern was quite passionate about the requirement to embrace the science, embrace the technology, and use the great gifts that God gave us in terms of science and technology for the betterment of humanity. He talks about how thankful we are to God for giving us ways to avert the scourge of Tay-Sachs. He says he gave wisdom and knowledge to the physicians, he says, to the experts, physicians meaning the whole industry, the testers, the scientists, the geneticists, the counselors, to avoid these terrible things. He explains the whole idea of recessive genetic diseases. And then he uses remarkably strong language. He says, even stronger than Rabbi Feinstein, he says some say that genetic testing, this type of testing, involves a lack of bitachon, a lack of trust, a lack of reposing our trust in God. He says, chas v'shalom, that's nonsense. He says, people who talk like that do not know what they're talking about. He says, on the contrary, you're obligated to test when you can, he says. And then he says something remarkably strong. He says, I'm nearly convinced, he says, anyone who can test and does not do so, he says, and as a result, something terrible happens with his offspring, he says, his hands are soiled with the blood of his children, he says, the blood of his damaged children. He cannot say that my hands have not spilled this blood, he says. He will have to answer before God. Not only is he considered reckless, like stepping out into traffic, Rabbi Stern says he's virtually guilty of manslaughter, of having brought the catastrophe on his own progeny, he says. And Rabbi Stern, again, was vehement in his insistence that testing must be done. If it can, it must, and we should be thankful to God for giving us the opportunity. And again, that is generally the consensus. Many other authorities have ruled this way as well, that testing is a good idea, required. The late Rabbi Zalman Nehemiah Goldberg in Israel, another leading authority on family law, on Jewish law in general, says that you are chayav, there is a chiyuv, there's an obligation, he says, to do testing, because he invokes a classic halachic principle. He says, in general, that halacha has a system where we don't always have perfect information. We rely on probabilities, we rely on presumptions. That's when perfect information is not available, he says. But to the extent that better information is available, we have to acquire it, he says. We have to obtain it. The Torah never wants us to rely on assumptions and hopes and prayers. If that's the best we can do, then yes, then we hope and we pray. But if we rely on presumptions. But if we can do better, if we can get accurate information, we have to do so, he says. That's a general obligation. It applies in ritual law. It applies in family planning as well, he says. To the extent that we are able to do testing and we're able to avert these things via testing, then it is obligatory to do so. A person has no excuse to say, I'll just hope for the best. That was a plan for thousands of years when there was nothing they could do, when the science hadn't obtained the techniques we have today. Then yes, then you have to rely on hope and doing your best. But today you don't have to. So then you can't. Then you have to obtain the best possible information that you are able to. The one great holdout of which I'm aware is Rabbi Menashe Klein. Rabbi Menashe Klein was another Hasidic posek from New York, also from that era. He was also very, very reactionary. He tended to be extremely conservative on many issues. He was uncomfortable with modern science and modern culture in many ways. He actually felt that testing was not appropriate. He invoked Tamim Tiem Hashem Elokecha. We should trust God. We should let Him handle things. We should not feel the need to meddle. We should not feel the need to meddle with nature, with hidden things. We should not try to. Some information is better left as a mystery, left unknown, and we should simply rely on God and hope that God will work things out for the best. As I said, Rabbi Klein was a distinguished authority, but in this case in particular, he is an outlier. He is the exception that proves the rule. And in general, virtually everyone, Rav Ovadia Yosef, whether the greatest authority among the Sfardim in Israel, also in that era, also was strongly in favor of, he was talking about Dar Yesharim, as many of the early authorities were. He was strongly in favor on pragmatic grounds. You can save lives, you can do tremendous good. Why wouldn't you? So in general, that is the consensus, and that is the dominant consensus. That is widely, if not universally, accepted in Orthodox circles today, following the authority of Rabbi Feinstein and the various other authorities. And Rabbi Klein is an outlier. The normative practice, the normative the normative halachic consensus does not follow his position. That speaks to the question of testing in general. As to what specifically we should test for, this is a somewhat more controversial question. As we've seen, the testing began in Orthodox circles in particular. Testing began with Dar Yesharim. Now we have JCreen. People can get private testing, as we heard, from doctors and other places. Each of these organizations, each of these testing systems will test for different things. Some of them come with a fixed test. JCreen will give you their list of tests, or Yesharim has various panels they do. With your doctor, obviously, with private testing, you have other options. You can test for whatever your doctor is willing to test you for. So the question is, what is the Torah perspective on what we should test for? And here is where we find some divergence between Orthodox opinion as to the basic question is how broadly we should test. Should we be testing maximalist, testing for everything we possibly can? Should we be testing minimalist, only testing for those things that are absolutely essential? And here we find some cleavage between the different organizations. Dar Yesharim tests for fewer things. JCreen tests for more. Dar Yesharim has been criticized by various authorities in opposite directions. Some people have argued that they test for too much. Some people have said they should test for more. Rav Hershel Schechter, we mentioned, says, do what JCreen does. Test for everything. Test for as much as you can. Just like Rabbi Feinstein said, not testing for something that you can test for is like closing your eyes to danger. So test for anything you can. Why not? The knowledge is power. Why not know whatever you can? Others have criticized Dar Yesharim for testing for too much. Rabbi Moshe David Tendler, Rabbi Feinstein's son-in-law, and a leading Talmudist and bioethicist at Yeshiva University, he was reported as being critical of Dar Yesharim for testing for too much. He said he doesn't see the need for it. He said some years ago, he said there are 90 genes you don't want to have. He says, you want to test for everything. He says, you're going to stop breaking up marriage and breaking up relationships for no reason. He says, do we really want to do that? Rabbi, he felt that Dar Yesharim was a good idea, but it had gone too far. And he felt that we should not be testing for every single thing that we can possibly test for. His quote is that his quote was, when do you stop? He says, will this lead to people showing each other computer printouts of their genetic conditions? We'll never get married, he said. I think some would say, yes, it's a great idea to show people computer printouts of their genetic conditions. We can avert all kinds of misery, and we can find better compatibility, or we can do some of the other solutions to avoid having children, as we'll discuss soon. But Rabbi Tendler has criticized people for over-testing. Rabbi Shmuel First of Chicago has also said that he thinks that Dar Yesharim was a noble idea, but they test for too much. You shouldn't test for that much. He said he focuses on probabilities. He says Tay-Sachs, which is such a relatively frequent problem and devastating. I understand you want to test for that, he says, but to test for everything, even things which are relatively less frequent, he says, you don't need to test for all that. So contemporary Orthodox authorities have disagreed as to how broadly you should test for everything, don't test for everything. Some of the question, of course, is linked, certain aspects of this question are linked to what you're going to do with this testing. If your testing will simply lead you to some of the more palatable solutions, like, as we'll discuss soon, PGT testing of embryos, where the couple can be married, lead a happy life, and just make sure their embryos are healthy, that's not such a bad outcome. If you're going to do it on Dar Yesharim's model, where they simply report incompatible and the marriage never gets off the ground, then you have Rabbi Tendler's concern that you're going to end up with knocking off all kinds of marriages that otherwise might be successful. Okay, but this is a question about which contemporary authorities disagree, and again, you can consult your rabbinic authority as to which of these forms of testing a person is preferred, and how much should you test for, and so on. Similarly, with the question of age, when should you test? So we heard earlier that the reproductive testing is typically not done before 18. The cancer testing, Estie mentioned, is done they do at 21. So the halacha, Jewish law, doesn't really have a precise and rigorous recommendation for how old you should be. Rabbi Feinstein, who was the original and most important supporter of this, he was very concerned about stigma. He felt that people would be stigmatized when they learned they were carriers, even though genetic counselors can explain there's nothing to feel stigma about. you're healthy in every way. It's not your fault. You can, as long as you don't actually have Tay-Sachs, the gene doesn't mean anything. There's no reason to feel stigma. Stigma is not something that logic and reason are going to completely eliminate. Rabbi Feinstein felt that stigma was a real issue, and therefore he encouraged that this testing be done not when people were young. It would just lead to pointless agonizing about it. It should be done closer to when people were marriageable age. He felt it should be done discreetly, and it should be done in ways, and that led to Darya Sharm's model of doing it in ways that they don't even reveal to the people themselves the results. All that was concern about stigma. Others felt that the argument leads in the opposite direction. Others felt that it's precisely that kind of attitude that leads to stigma. When you treat it like a stigma, it becomes a stigma. When you treat it like a great secret that has to be suppressed, nobody knows, that everything is just numbers, that's what leads to stigma. If you simply demystify it and give everyone full information, that would eliminate the stigma. So that's obviously a much more American, much more Western idea. Rabbi Tendler has been critical of Darya Sharm. He felt that it's un-American to not give people their own results. Others disagree. Many of the more traditional rabbis apparently think it's a good idea. Rabbi Feinstein felt it should all be done with a maximum of discretion. He didn't discuss exactly what model he recommended, but he also discussed, he very much was concerned with the notion of stigma. But again, these are questions about the details. But in general, the overwhelming consensus is that the testing is appropriate. It should be done. It must be done. On that we have very solid agreement. With regard to the BRCA testing, Rabbi First has said that even though it's good to test, but he said it can wait till a woman's older. She has time to take care of this later in life, that the risks are not that high when she's young. I don't actually know the science. I'm not familiar with the latest and greatest science about the risks of BRCA, the predisposition to breast cancer at a young age. He recommended waiting till she's 40, waiting till she's post her childbearing years. But in general, again, the basic idea would be it's good to test because there are things we can do, as we heard earlier. There are various types of, we can increase the screening, we can do prophylactic surgeries and so on, mastectomies. So the general idea would seem to be it's a good idea. Something as relatively easy to test for as BRCA, something with as high, as consequential as BRCA. It would be, my understanding is it would be a good idea to test. Exactly when to test and so on, that's more a subject for debate. I want to wind it up, but just briefly to discuss two of the issues that Estie raised earlier. The question of one of the things we can do if a couple are already together and they're carriers, one of the things we can do to avoid the children having these recessive genetic diseases is to use donor sperm or eggs. To have the couple can have children via donations of sperm or egg by a third party, not a member of the couple. That's something which was very controversial among halachic authorities in the mid-20th century. Rabbi Feinstein here was a famously lenient view in certain cases, limited cases. In certain cases, he did allow donor sperm. This was one of the fiercest and most heated controversies of the 20th century. This is a subject that was a subject of tremendous debate. Again, we're not going to get into this in detail. Certainly, if a person is considering, if this is one of the options that arises during genetic counseling, a person should certainly consult competent rabbinic authority on the question. And one final point, one thing you can do is if a couple are both carriers for the recessive disease, they can simply test. We heard about the CVS testing, the amniocentesis of the testing essentially the embryo and seeing if he's seeing if the baby is going to have problems. And typically, aside from education that Estie mentioned, typically the action you take is going to be to abort. There's not much we can do to treat these things at this point, but typically the action that we take is to abort. So abortion of a fetus, which we know is going to be terribly, terribly deformed, is an extremely controversial question. On this point, Rabbi Feinstein was the most stringent of all opinions. Rabbi Feinstein and all of his disciples and followers, particularly in the United States, were vehemently opposed to this. They felt that abortion was essentially murder, that abortion was not permitted, even in the case of a fetus that was going to be as badly deformed and as fatally diseased. And with Tay-Sachs, you cannot do it. And in the United States, Rabbi Feinstein's opinion has a great deal of traction that it is absolutely prohibited. Rabbi Feinstein is not the only view. Rabbi Eliezer de Waldenberg in Israel, one of the leading experts on medical halacha, he was lenient about Tay-Sachs within certain parameters. The consensus, again, some of Rabbi Feinstein's followers say that his view is the consensus. Others say that Rabbi Waldensberg's view is the consensus. Again, this is certainly not the forum to take sides here. But again, someone who finds him or herself in this terrible, terrible situation should certainly consult competent rabbinic authority for practical guidance. Thank you all so much for listening, and I think we can take questions now.
Thank you, Rabbi Grossman. That was really a very terrific analysis and presented so much information that I'm sure everybody learned a great deal. Really appreciate it. I do want to turn it over to questions in just a minute. If anybody wants to go ahead, we will give people a chance to also ask questions without putting in the chat. But if you wanted to quickly put something in the chat, you hadn't had a chance to do so, please go right ahead. Part of the reason that we have programs like this is to reduce stigma around talking about these things and learning about them so that people can make choices that are consistent with the knowledge that they get and their values. So we really, again, appreciate Estie Rose from JCreen coming and Rabbi Grossman from the Greater Washington Community Kollel. All right. Dr. Shazovsky, can I turn it over to you to look for any questions that were already in the chat?
Sure. Thank you both so much. That was fascinating. I'm speechless. So thank you both so much. I really, really appreciate it. We all really appreciate it. Right now, I don't see any questions in the chat. If I can ask my own question, Estie, I don't know if you've had the chance to read the book Mercies in Disguise. For anybody that hasn't read it, it's absolutely fascinating. And it's about a family that has found out that they have this really, really debilitating genetic disease. And I don't want to reveal anything, but I highly recommend it for everybody. It brings up so many, it's written for the layperson. You do not have to have a science background, but it just brings up so many thoughtful and emotional and thought-provoking things that were discussed tonight on both levels. So Estie, I was going to ask what you thought about it, but I guess I will. It's called.
I wrote it down. I gotta request it from my library.
By Gina Kollel, and it's really, really fascinating. So if anyone has any questions, I guess you can.
Abigail, I guess a couple of people must have private messaged me. One is a question and one is a comment. They actually both revolve around Dor Yesharim, so I don't know how Estie. Different kind of injury here. All right. They both revolve around Dor Yesharim, so I'm not sure how much information you would have on this, but one person said that their understanding is that Dor Yesharim requires people not get testing or sign something that they will not get any other type of testing, and they're wondering if you know how binding that is. So
that's actually, I think, a question for Rabbi Grossman. I actually recently had a situation like this where a girl had gotten tested when she was in Stern many years ago by Dor Yesharim. They don't go to Stern anymore. But she signed that, paper saying that this was all she was going to do. And now years later, she learned more and decided she wanted to use JCreen. So what should she do? And I was like, I don't know, ask your rabbi, because you or your lawyer. This is not a genetics question. And she actually, it took a while till she got back to me and she decided not to do the test. I don't know what happened in between, but maybe Rabbi Grossman can speak to this.
Yeah, so it's a good question, and in the course of preparing for this event tonight, I actually came across some discussion of this. I came across people discussing, asking questions about whether this contract was binding or not. I believe I saw someone asking one of the YU Rosh Yeshiva, perhaps or Schechter, perhaps someone else, whether this contract was binding, and was told that it was not. But this is an anonymous or pseudonymous secondhand report on the internet somewhere, and I would not quote that with any degree of authority. I don't have anything definitive to say on the topic. In general, the laws of contracts in Torah law are complex. A contract, which is a commitment to do something, is as opposed to buying and selling. A contract, the binding yourself to do or not to do something, is the subject of considerable controversy, particularly in this case where the agreement is entered into without perhaps a full realization of the consequences, and where the options and the possibilities have changed and evolved. It could be debated. All that being said, Halacha does treat someone's word, even in the absence of a binding contract, a person's word is a very serious thing. She'eretz Yisrael lo yasu avla v'lo yidabru chazav. There's a halachic imperative to keep your word. On the third hand, again, everything in Talmudic law has multiple hands. On the third hand, in a case where circumstances have changed, where you don't have full realization and understanding, sometimes you can back out of a commitment. So I'm not going to go too much further into this. It is a very good question, and I would have to look into it further. But I didn't prepare this particular point in enough detail to be able to answer definitively on this. So it's an important question. It's a good question, but I don't have much more to say on it on the spot.
Thank you.
At JCreen, we always ask a question about, have you had previous testing? And multiple times a day, I'll see people write that they did Dori Sharim. So I guess they didn't care about their contract, but it does come up every now and then.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. There's a couple more questions in the chat that I can see, so I'm just going to throw them out there. One, Estie, I think this is for you. Is there anything that is testing for autism? If there are several cousins in a family that have autism, is that something to discuss with a genetic counselor and perhaps be tested for? Can you speak to that?
That's a really good question. So autism is not so well understood, or we think we understand it, but we don't have a good answer for you. Most cases of autism are known to be multifactorial, which means that they are due to some genetic changes in a person, but also some other external factors like environmental or something like that. So when it's not one gene that causes it, like Tay-Sachs or BRCA, there's no one test you can do because it's a little bit of this, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. So unfortunately, there's no test that exists for autism. It's not a JCreen thing. It's a doesn't exist kind of thing. There are some genetic conditions that are, one gene conditions that have autistic-like symptoms as part of the syndrome. So Fragile X is a really good example of something that we test for, where kids might seem like they have autism, but they actually have Fragile X. So there are a couple of diseases that we are testing for that do have autism or autistic-like symptoms, but autism in general is not something that one can test for.
Thank you. One question that I think you probably both could have a perspective on. Somebody asks, when starting to date, what's the upside and downside of knowing what a person carries before it is necessary to see what gene a couple might match for? I'm going to just reframe that to think that maybe when do you tell somebody? Like, is there any guidance from either genetic counselor or rabbinic guidance, halachic guidance of what is your obligation at what point? I guess this isn't speaking to Dori Sharim now. This would be speaking if you're with JCreen with an open testing model and you know what you have. At what point do you discuss?
So I've seen like a lot of variation here. I've seen people tell too late, and I've seen really sad stories happen because of it. I think just based on my experience that the best time to talk about it is a couple of dates in. It doesn't mean you want to marry this person or you're not making a statement, like that. But I think it's better for couples to know if they are going to be a carrier couple earlier on in the relationship so they can decide, how to proceed with it. I didn't mention this earlier, but that slide that I had with all of the different options for carrier couples, it's not easy, doing IVF, having a CVS or amniocentesis and possibly terminating a pregnancy. It's a big deal, not only halachically, but emotionally. And, there's a lot to it. So it's not something that I would say, oh, you just met, why don't you just do IVF? It's not that simple. And I think it is really great in certain circumstances. And there are a lot of couples who are able to have, beautiful families because of it. So it's a wonderful option for some people. But I wouldn't say to do that unless you're already in a committed relationship, and you'll have more clarity, I think, if you know earlier on in a relationship, if possible. There's also trust issues, and why would you be hiding something from somebody? It's not a good way to go into a marriage. So generally speaking, I think the earlier the better. I don't know if Rabbi Grossman has anything to add here.
So there is a lot of discussion about this among contemporary authorities. And I'll just add, by the way, that this can happen or used to be able to happen with Dori Sharim as well. certainly when they tested for fewer diseases, if a person ever tested positive, it used to be when they tested primarily for Tay-Sachs, a person would know he was a carrier if he ever tested positive. Now they test for 50 things. You're not going to know what you're a carrier for, but there are cases where people find out people do find out that they're a carrier. The question is about telling people. So on the one hand, the halacha is clear that a person is obligated to disclose material information to another party before marriage, before entering into any kind of committed relationship. The question is when to tell. So contemporary authorities are all over the map, and this is not really a question that's limited to genetic information. This can happen to any kind of information that may put you at a disadvantage. Mental illness, a person has suffered with mental illness, a person has other skeletons in his closet, a person has student debt, a person has there are all kinds of things a person can reveal about himself that he or she may be reluctant to disclose immediately on the grounds that people will say there's plenty of fish in the sea, I'll just look for somebody else before getting involved in this. So halachists have tried to give guidelines for when information about various potentially awkward or embarrassing or discouraging things should be revealed. There isn't really any real precedent for this in formal classic codes of law. My impression is that halakhic authorities tend to give kind of seat of the pants practical advice about when there's always a trade-off, because we can say that, like Estie said, we can say that earlier is better than later, but how early? We don't really encourage people on the first date to start saying, here's all my cards, mental illness for 8 years, I've been on this and this medication. We don't really expect this all to happen while you're still exchanging messages by text or whatever. We do understand that people that should get to know each other at least a little bit before they start revealing every single possibly embarrassing thing about themselves. So the question really is how far? 1 date, 1 phone call, 2 dates, 4 dates. So halakhic authorities in general have tried to have given guidelines and advice about when exactly in the process all kinds of information. And again, they do some kind of formal or informal balancing test between how serious is the information, how likely is it to be something that might be a turnoff initially, but doesn't really matter that much if you get to know somebody. And they try to make these judgment calls, but it's difficult. I think it's difficult or impossible to really formulate exact rules. Again, earlier better than later obviously is advantageous to avoid trust issues later, to avoid causing terrible pain if they do decide to break it off, and so on, to avoid wasting everyone's time, money, and wear and tear on their emotional health if they break it off. On the other hand, disclosing everything immediately can simply put a damper on relationships which otherwise could be perfectly viable. So poskim, I think, have tried to kind of find some kind of happy medium. What it is exactly, I don't know. People don't ask me these questions, and I really have no idea. I've never really seen kind of a rigorous basis, anything derived from first principles for how to determine this. But my impression is that many authorities will say you don't need to disclose everything before the first date, but that certainly things should be disclosed before they're engaged. Certainly by the time a relationship is getting serious. I've heard figures like 4 dates for this, or some other number like that. Obviously, 4 dates means something different in some communities than other communities. So it's not even possible to really give a fixed number of dates. So to some extent, I think it's more a judgment call more than anything else. But those are, I think, the 2 sides of the tension. You don't want to ruin relationships unnecessarily, preemptively. You also don't want to waste everyone's time, money, and hurt people. So you have to find some balance between them.
Thank you. So we have 2 more questions, and we'll end with that, and a comment. And so again, the comment revolves around Rory Sharms. I want to briefly mention that comment, but then also explain what somebody suggested, that they understand that Dory Sharm now, if people test positive for things, will counsel. I think they're suggesting that maybe not just say don't get married. We can't speak to that. We did invite a representative from Dory Sharm to speak with us tonight. Unfortunately, the timing didn't work out and they weren't available. So we are, I'm hesitant to answer on their behalf, but certainly that it would be interesting. And I'm sure that they are available, and Representative from Dory Sharm could be contacted privately, and you could and should ask any of these questions. In terms of the questions that we have left, there was one for Estie, for JCreen, for the cancer testing. Why 21?
So it's a little bit arbitrary. Really, we wanted to do 25. And the reason that 25 is that magic number is because when somebody's positive for, let's say, a BRCA mutation or any other mutation, The earliest that guidelines would start in terms of doing mammograms or whatever it is would be age 25. So initially, when we were creating this test, we were thinking, why do people under 25 need to know if there's nothing they can do about it? It could be quite an emotional burden on people, especially in the shidduch world, like that, a young woman knowing that she has a BRCA mutation, that's something big to have to disclose to a guy. So we kind of were a little bit paternalistic, and we were trying to protect these young women, like, just don't get tested. There's no reason. But once you're 25, yeah, there's a clinical reason to do it, because if you're positive, we're going to want to, be on top of things and be careful about everything. And when we launched, we actually did say 25. And we realized pretty quickly that a lot of people who come through JCreen are also doing the reproductive carrier screening, and they're in that younger stage, right? In that 19, 20, 21, 22, and they would be on our website and they would see that we also offer this cancer test, and they'd sign up for both. And we said, okay, if they really want to know their information, that's fine. So we now allow anybody 21 or older to do it, but if they're under 25, we send them an email before we run the test, and we say, sure you want to do this, we kind of explain the implications of what can happen just in case they are positive, and we give them an out, and very often they'll say, oh yeah, I'm not ready for this, I don't want to do this now. But we'll also have a lot of people who will say, yeah, my mom had breast cancer when she was 30 and I'm freaking out and I want to get tested. So we just give them, that's like another touch point that you'll have with a genetic counselor, is when we review your case, we'll see how old you are, and we'll say, like, whoa, you sure you want to do this? And we'll respect them if they do want to do it, and we'll refund them if they don't.
Great, thank you. And I'll reiterate that part of the reason we do a program like this is in the hope that as time goes on, fewer and fewer people will freak out when they hear these things, and instead will come at it again from a perspective of understanding and knowledge, and know where to get guidance, both from genetic counselors and halachic authorities, and feel like these are all matters and issues that with God's help they can deal with. So thank you for that. There is one more question that I'll put out there. So people had specific questions, again, about what type of genes you could test for, and I would suggest that they contact Estie, whose information I'll send out again afterwards if you didn't catch it before, and also go on the JCreen website where you can learn a lot more in terms of what types of things you can test for. But I will conclude with this question. Somebody asked, well, is there a benefit for two parents to be tested to see what their children might have if they're now beyond childbearing age? So in other words, they'd like to do it so that they could be able to tell their children in advance, I guess, what you might be carriers for. Maybe that, I don't know if the person is asking if that would help target the testing more or not. So is there any benefit to people post childbearing age to get tested for these recessive genes?
So I would say back in the day of genetic testing, that was really common. The testing used to be very expensive, and you would test gene by gene. You'd rack up quite a bill. It could have cost $7,000, $8,000, $9,000 even. It was pretty crazy. So in order to kind of get ahead of the game, you'd have a lot of couples getting tested so that they'll know which diseases their kids need to be tested for, instead of just doing everything on everybody. It's kind of changed a lot since then, and now we don't recommend that parents do that. We think that people should get tested for themselves because the pricing is exactly the same. We have this amazing technology now. It's called array technology, where you can test for everything all on one little chip, and it's rather cheap. You saw the pricing before. So price-wise, there's no reason to only test, for a few things at a time. And also, we think that it's good for people to know what they carry, not what their parents carry. This way they'll know what their kids might be at risk for, their other relatives might be at risk for. So it's really, really not that common for that older generation to get tested for their kids. It's now much more common for the younger generation to do it. We recommend that the people having the babies should be getting tested.
Perfect, thank you. I realized something you said reminds me that I wanted to raise a point and get your reaction to this, and perhaps your guidance for everybody. And that is, I noticed on the JCreen website that there is an option, obviously, to pay, and thank you for the discount code, that's great. And there is an option also to use insurance, I think maybe with especially the cancer genetic testing, which can be covered by people's insurance. So the point I'd like to bring out and ask you for to comment on is, I think sometimes people choose to use their insurance, and sometimes people choose not to because out of fear of that information somehow being at some point used against them. I think at this stage of the game, pre-existing conditions, you can't be denied health insurance in the United States for pre-existing conditions or pre-existing genetic conditions. But, I suppose people never know when those things could change, would they change, and in which case could that information be potentially damaging. On the other hand, if you do want to go ahead and do any of these preventative measures or screenings, you then would have to probably go through insurance. For most people would too, because the cost would be high for those things. That's one thing. And then the other thing, though, which is a little bit different, but something I've heard about, is life insurance. That when to purchase life insurance if you're going to do the genetic screening cancer gene, because life insurance, I don't believe, does have to follow those rules about denying coverage if you have pre-existing conditions, including pre-existing genetic conditions. So health insurance, life insurance, Estie, take it away.
Yeah, that was a really good question, Audrey. So this is part of our counseling. Anytime somebody does genetic testing, we recommend that they have pre-test counseling. Like, what are you getting yourself into? What kind of information are you going to learn? And part of our pre-test counseling, this is all done through a video at JCreen at least, is this insurance question. We never want somebody to be in a situation where they test positive and then they go to apply for life insurance. Also, by the way, disability insurance, long-term care insurance, and those insurance companies say, we don't want you on our plan. You have a BRCA mutation. We don't want to deal with that and the cost related to that. So we do counsel people before they get tested. We say, make sure that you have those insurances in place before you get your testing and before you get your results, because just in case there's a problem, you're not hiding anything. You never got tested. So when you applied, nothing was going on. So unfortunately, there are no laws that protect people from getting discriminated against in those realms of insurance. When it comes to health insurance, there are a couple of exceptions. There's always exceptions to every rule, but generally speaking, people cannot be denied health insurance. They can't be charged a higher premium than the rest of the people in their plan, or anything like that because of genetic testing results. Also part of this law is called the GINA law, that all the stuff that I'm talking about. As part of the GINA law, there's also rules and regulations regarding employment. So somebody can't be fired or not hired or not promoted because or on the grounds of having a genetic mutation. So there definitely are things or laws or bills that are protecting people against their their information being used against them, but we have a long way to go, unfortunately. And that's why we counsel people to try to take care of this stuff beforehand, just in case. We would hate for somebody to get into trouble because of this. When it comes to the reproductive carrier screening, that's not as big of an issue, right? Because if somebody's positive, they're not predisposed to something. It's more of the cancer testing where it could be a problem.
Right. Thank you. And thank you for emphasizing that at the end.
Yeah.
Wow. Once again, thank you so much to Estie, Rose of JCreen, and Rabbi Grossman from the Greater Washington Community Kollel. You gave fantastic presentations. We greatly appreciate your time. And I want to thank all of you for joining us. And I hope everybody felt like they learned a lot. If you do have follow-up questions and you want to get in contact with either of our speakers, email me. And here, go ahead and I will put that in the chat too, just in case, how you could reach me. You could also go to the Bikur Cholim of Greater Washington website, where you can get contact information for the organization there. And of course, you can also find out about all of our programs and services, including upcoming educational programs. Save the date on October 23rd. We'll be hosting a program together with Renewal, the kidney donor organization, and that will actually be in person, God willing, not on Zoom. So stay tuned for more information about that. Again, thank you so much, everybody. I want to wish everybody a good night, and stay healthy, stay proactive. Good night, everyone.